Roy, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you.
Looking forward to speak about courage and facilitation.
I'm looking forward to speak about courage and facilitation as well, to share some knowledge, to learn from you. I've
Yeah.
all week I've been excited for this moment.
Yay! Likewise. And before we start, the question with which I always kick it off, and sometimes we go places and maybe we end up not talking about courage. Um, when did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Uh, when I facilitate, sometimes I think that I call myself a facilitator. I'm not sure. I think when I first time it was actually a label that was put on me. I was labeled as a facilitator. I joined a company that did leadership training and they called us facilitators. And so up until then, when I worked as an educator, I was an adjunct professor at the university. I saw myself as a teacher first and foremost, and I would describe myself when people ask like, "What do you do for a living?" I'm like, "I'm a teacher." I like that. Some of my favorite people in the world have been teachers, and so I called myself a teacher, identified as a teacher among other things. But then when I was stamped as a facilitator, I had to think about like what that means.
Mm.
And I like to look up the origin of words. And I remember that when at first I started calling myself a facilitator, I looked that up and I saw that the origin of the word means to make easier. The Latin origin of the word facile is to make easier. And I thought, you can't really be a good teacher without being a good facilitator, without making that transfer of knowledge easier for folks, without simplifying the complexity, without helping them develop in whatever way you want to do. And then it became like a badge of honor to call yourself a facilitator. And so I
Mm.
started doing so. Um, my main role today is shifted a little bit, and so I facilitate a lot, but I don't know if it's as primary, as salient an aspect of my identity as it used to be.
Mm. So, how did your, before I ask you how you self identify today, let me first ask the question, how did the realization of facilitation is and can do impact your teaching?
Well, I think I'm. It's a great question. Um, I started thinking about, well, what are some of the ways that I can simplify the complexity, and what are some of the ways that I can make this easier on the participant, whatever this is, whatever the goal
Mm.
is of the training. And the moment I started asking those questions is the moment where I became conscious of what I was doing well and what I could do better. And so just thinking about the idea of what a facilitator is helped me become a better facilitator and a better teacher.
Mm. Also, maybe because the attention shifts from the self to the group, to the other, to the recipient of the knowledge.
Yeah, there's less. I think that's another really great point. Less concern, less focus in, more focus out, and
Mm.
less concern for self, more concern for others, which makes you also less self-conscious, makes you less anxious as a teacher and as a facilitator, and you really are focused on the people there.
Yeah.
Gives you more courage too.
Mm. What do you mean by that?
Well, the the literature on courage shows us that one of the most dominant strategies that people utilize to engender, to summon courage, is to link up their actions to something beyond themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm going into the classroom focusing out as opposed to navel gazing and focusing in, then I'm less anxious and I'm willing to, and whatever fears and anxieties that I may contain, I'm overcoming them for the sake of the group or for the sake of the purpose of the session itself.
Mm. Good point. And I think as a facilitator, you also trust that the group has some knowledge and you can pull it out. You can include them in whatever you're going to create for them. So it
Yeah,
takes a lot of pressure off your shoulders.
it does, right? And you start to think, it goes back to those earlier questions, like how can I make this easier for folks? How can I make this how can I simplify that complexity? How can I bring them into the conversation? You move from like a power over perspective as
Mm-hmm.
the teacher, as the almighty teacher, to a power with. And like we're collaborating, we're doing this together.
And I wonder, before we hit the record button, we spoke about questions.
Yeah.
And when I think of the traditional teacher, the teacher would ask questions where there is a right answer to. Whereas the more interesting questions that might facilitate the learning in the longer term are the questions that make the students think. And asking a question where there's not a right answer, but make the student think, requires more courage because you cannot control the answers that come up. So you're basically putting yourself in a situation where you have to react with whatever comes up instead of just saying, sorry, it's wrong, next one.
Right. Yeah. So on that note, Miriam, do you have a favorite type of question do you like to ask to make that happen?
Yes, I think there are a few questions, and then it depends on the topic and the context, right? I think they're nice questions. They're easy to answer. They're kind of nice icebreakers. Everyone can just blabber something. But then there are kind questions that after you ask them, you have this silence where everyone is like, ooh, let me think about that. And I think these are the real interesting ones where you can get the group to, and these are usually the ones that challenge the status quo. I was recently asked the question, what do you tolerate? Or yesterday I was with a group of colleagues and the question came up, what do you stand for? And if you ask this to a team, maybe you don't need much more of an agenda for the remaining program.
Yeah. And so here you think about like categories of questions and questions that you said nice, and the other category was kind. So he said, and your kind was to challenge the status quo. That's interesting. Yeah. What are your thoughts about like defaulting into a mode of like not just inquiry, but people often talk about open-ended questions. I broaden the space for response, closed-ended questions. Any thoughts on that?
Don't get me into questions. I can speak about questions at tomorrow. What I find interesting are the why questions, and I would be curious about your relationship with why questions. Because for me, a why question can be sharp like a knife, almost like a weapon, because a why question doesn't invite to wander or to dream or to go on to tangents. A why question focus on the core, on the beliefs, on identities. So you need sufficient amount of trust to ask the why questions. On the other hand, the what if questions, they keep you safe. These are the nice questions. Everyone can think of a what if. And the reason why I said kind for challenging is that a kind question empowers you and gives you autonomy or agency to create your own solution and to seek for an answer within yourself instead of just going for the easy route.
Yeah. My thoughts on why questions, I have, I guess, a love-hate relationship with why questions. I put them in the category of reasoning questions because they get the root of things. And I love that. And I think that's so important, especially when trying to understand behavior, when negotiating, trying to understand somebody's interests in situations of conflict. Like why questions are golden, but they can come across as accusatory and judgmental. And so for me, what I do with why questions is I put them in a frame. And what I mean by that is I add a preamble or I qualify the question before I ask it. So I may say something like, just to understand where you're coming from. And then I would ask my question. Or just make sure we're on the same page, whatever it is. The point is that you're making your intentions explicit before you ask the question as a way to disarm the defensiveness that may come when somebody's beginning to wonder, why are they asking me that question? And so, of course, the tone.
I love that.
The tone matters as well, and how you ask why questions. And I think there's also a cultural aspect to this as well. Like I think that I'm originally from Israel, and if I pay attention to the patterns of questions that we ask in Hebrew, why question is very, 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 very common. And I think here in the US, where I'm situated right now, I learned to be more sensitive to that question. In hostage negotiation, where situation is very, very tense, FBI protocol is to try to avoid those why questions and to maybe pivot to a what question, and which is very similar, like what's important to you about this, as opposed to why is this important to you, or a how question. Still open-ended. But I have my issue with open-ended, but we'll come back to that, maybe.
Yes, we'll come back to that, the open-ended questions. And I wonder whether the why question, so thank you for elaborating that. I love it. And to have a preamble to prepare the ground, to facilitate the why question is a very good tip. And I wonder whether they might be avoided because they trigger too many emotions. So then it's difficult to regulate the emotions that the why elicits.
It may be, again, it's how you ask it, and it's the tone, and I think, as you said earlier, it's the relationship you have with that person. Like if you ask why questions of yourself, you're not going to get offended.
Yes.
And why is that? Because there's kind of there's assumption of positive intent in the authenticity of the question itself.
And maybe it's okay. I'm thinking out loud. Maybe it's the same reason why we cannot tickle ourselves.
Which is it's a mystery. Why can't we expect it? Why is it?
I don't know, but I think it's because we expect it. And the same thing as if we ask ourselves why questions, we cannot offend ourselves because it's somehow expected. We stay in the safe zone.
For those of you who are just listening to this conversation, Miriam and Oya are trying to tickle themselves as so we speak. You can't tickle someone virtually either.
No, that's true. Well, maybe with a question.
Maybe tickle my brain. There should be like a tickle emoji or something here.
Yes. Ah, good one. What is it about open questions that you don't like?
It's been gospel. It's not like I'm against open questions. It's like being against puppies in our world. If you're like against open-ended questions, I'm not against open-ended questions. There's a gospel in the world of learning and development and facilitation and so on, that you should default into asking open-ended questions. And there's a logic to it. You want to broaden the space for response as opposed to constrict it and narrow it. Those closed-ended questions supposedly lend themselves to a binary yes or no response. I get it. My experience is that it's very rare that when you ask a closed-ended question that you're just going to get like yes, no. So, for example, if you were to ask, can you walk me through your thinking? It's a closed-ended question.
Sure.
How often people are going to be like, yes, and then just be quiet. So most closed-ended questions will tend to have an open-ended response. In addition to that, like sometimes it might be qualitatively different, and it is also true that sometimes you want short answers. You do want concise and short answers. You might do that deliberately. There's a function to closed-ended questions. In negotiation, for example, closed-ended questions, if you want to find out if somebody's lying, closed-ended questions are much better than open-ended questions. For example,
why would that be?
Well, let's say I have here my phone with me, and let's say I want to sell my phone to you, and you are wondering, you want to know about the history of the phone. So you can ask like somebody like, what is the history of the phone? And hopefully they will share with you all the information that you need to know. That's very different than asking someone, has this phone been damaged? Just close-ended question. it's much more difficult to omit the truth than it is when open-ended questions where they can roam anywhere and still answer you authentically. So
because you can also avoid it. So in storytelling, you can hide the facts and then avoid the cognitive dissonance if nobody wants to be a liar.
Exactly.
Liar.
Right. So closed-ended questions have gotten a bad rap. They have a function, they have a utility, and they often give you a broader answer than most people think they do. And there's very little research that actually suggests that open-ended questions produce more than closed-ended questions. But we take it as gospel that that's in fact the case. For me, the more important question versus open versus closed is, I would put two more categories into our conversation, and one is authentic versus inauthentic question. Closed or open, and the follow-up question. For me, actually, the single most important question that you need to master as a facilitator, as a teacher, is a follow-up question. Because the follow-up question, be it closed or open, demonstrates that you're present, demonstrates that you're listening, demonstrates that you care. That's the question.
Thank you. Yes. Wasn't a question, my answer is yes. I love that for the reasons you mentioned. The follow-up questions show your presence. And the closed questions, I think it also depends whether it's a rhetoric question.
Yeah.
And because a closed question there can be different intentions behind a closed question.
Yeah.
Do you mind elaborating? It's actually not really a question. Please elaborate.
Right. It's a statement masquerading as a
exactly.
question. Yeah.
Have you ever thought of doing X? It's not a question. It's an advice.
Yeah.
And then, so I think sometimes we mask statements with a question mark and call it a question because we don't have the courage to make the statement.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why I said authentic versus inauthentic.
Yes. So never ask a question if you know the answer or if you're not interested in the answer.
Exactly. It's got to come from a place of genuine curiosity.
Yeah.
And whether closed or open. And those examples that you gave are examples of leading questions. They're statements pretending to be questions. They're not questions in my book.
Yeah.
But let me add one more thing in favor of closed-ended questions, which is not where I'm going to get like canceled for this. When it comes to kids, I again thinking about all my wisdom as a facilitator and as a teacher, I was like, let me ask you open-ended questions, and you get this blank cow-like stare in response, like they do not know how to respond. But when you begin, and I'm talking about ages 2, 3, 4, 5, when you ask more targeted questions that are close-ended and you're giving them more of a binary choice, do you want to do X, do you want to do Y, then there's much more of a response. When you say, how was school today, open-ended, if you're lucky, you'll get good. But if you
very interesting
specific questions about people's experience, like what is something new that you learned today, open-ended, but more specific, more targeted in that way, what is something surprising that you learned today, what questions did you ask today, then you're more likely to have a more interesting response.
And it reminds me of the boundaries that we need in order to be creative and for our brain to think, because we do need a context.
Yes.
If it's too broad, we are missing the context and then it's boring. The more context or the more boundaries we have around a topic or a question, the more interesting it gets, because then also the more nuanced it gets. And I once recorded a podcast episode with Thomas Lanthaler about the art of not asking questions. So his statement was, let's skip the questions at all and see how this goes. And we did a workshop actually around that. And what I took away that was fascinating is that questions keep us safe, especially when we're in the role of a facilitator, a coach, or even a parent. I'm not a parent. Oh. Asking a question keeps you on the safe side because you're putting the entire responsibility to come up with an answer on the shoulders of someone else. Whereas when you're making a statement, you're taking the risk.
Yes.
And you're making yourself vulnerable and allowing the other person to build on that. And this might then also be an argument for the closed questions. Mm-hmm. That you're basically helping the other person by restricting it and still leaving them the opportunity to say something else or to elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I like to mix it up. Like as my style as a facilitator, I'll deliberately ask closed-ended questions, open-ended questions, or not real questions. I like think about like an agenda break where somebody says, "Do you have any questions?" Closed-ended questions. I'll try that, and I'll try, "What questions do you have?" And I'll try thoughts, questions, observations, pushback. Yeah, and which is not structurally, like, grammatically a question, but it comes across as a question. And sometimes I'll try nothing, and I'll try silence and just experiment with it and see what works. And it creates also a variety for people's ears and eyes as I do that as a facilitator as well.
Yeah, which then brings again the art of facilitation in, where depending on the group, their dynamics, the audience, you have to adjust your tools.
That's right.
So there's not one size fits all.
Yeah.
So the question that I was parking in the beginning was, what label are you now putting on your forehead that it's not facilitation?
Well, I mean, I don't know. One of my favorite book is by a friend of mine called, her name is Irshad Manji, but the book is called Don't Label Me. But I guess there are some very meaningful labels to me as a husband, as a father. Like, that's the first things that come to mind. Professionally, it's I am a facilitator and I'm a teacher and I'm a professor, but a more salient identity for me these days is CEO and founder. So I don't go walking around like with that on my forehead, but that is part of my professional identity.
And how has facilitation helped you to become a better CEO and founder?
It's defaulting to that mode of inquiry. It's leading with a power with approach. You know, my approach as a leader is not a power over. And by the way, I mentioned this distinctions earlier. I got to give credit where credit is due. Are you familiar with that binary, power over versus power with?
Yes. And maybe you still want to explain that.
Yeah, I will. Of course. I closed-ended question, right? Are you familiar with it? The binary itself, or the concept dichotomy, comes from the work of somebody that I hope your audience gets to know. I hope they know, and if they don't, I hope they get to know somebody named of Mary Parker Follett, Follet, and she is maybe double T, I don't know, but she is somebody who is a public intellectual who lived 100 years ago, and in her writing, she wrote about conflict, she wrote about power, she wrote about management. She's the mother of modern negotiation theory, conflict resolution theory, and management theory as well. And most people know her ideas, but people have stolen her ideas, and people haven't given her the credit that she deserves. I'm on a mission to share her wisdom with folks. And one of her concepts was the idea of a power over versus power with. And I think as teachers, this is something that it's an approach that often we take. We take a power over, more directive approach. I have the wisdom, I have the knowledge, and I'm gonna share it with you. I'm gonna instruct, I'm gonna tell you how to think and what to think, or whatever it may be. And a power with is like we're co-creating something together. And so I of course I have my expertise, you have your knowledge, you have your wisdom, you have your experience, and we're going to create something together here that's going to be slightly unique or very unique than any other experience that we have with anyone else. And so I take that approach as a leader as well, and that means that I want to elicit voice. That means that I want to default to a mode of curiosity. I want to ask questions. I want to be attentive to the responses. I want to create a climate where people are willing to take interpersonal risks with one another without feeling like their status is on the line, their relationship or their job security is on the line. I want to create more psychological safety on my team. That I learned all of that as a facilitator. And I bring that into my leadership approach as well.
I love that. And it also relates to the leading from the front of the room versus the back of the room, or standing in a circle.
Yeah, that's so front of the room, back of the room, or standing in a circle. Walk me through standing in a circle.
Somehow when I just said it, so front of the room for me is really the teaching, the old school teaching style. Back of the room is what used to be said about the kind leader or the facilitator. So you're making yourself invisible, but then power with, for me, elicits more the image of standing in a circle with the group. So it's being together on equal side and having a conversation without the power dynamics, without the hierarchy.
Yeah, I think that there's still probably some power. I think there's always power dynamics in any room, and it doesn't mean that you have all the power. They might have all the power. All they got to do is just turn off their camera or go away or shut it down, or in a real classroom turn their backs to you or start talking and ignore you. Then you find out who has the power very, very quickly. And there's, by the way, a difference in being like a professor and being like working in organizations and doing workshops and trainings and all of that. You have a very different power, for sure. You don't really have an ability to reward or an ability to punish. That's not where your power comes from when you're facilitating. That's probably a very good thing. But there's still power dynamics in the room. And you have power that's born out of your expertise as well. You have power in the sense that you're structuring the conversation, and you're kind of at some point making decisions about where we're going on this journey together that the individuals may not make or may not know how to make. And you have tools that they may not have as well. And then you have your charisma, and that influences people as well. You have your tactics that you're using to influence people. So I wouldn't say there's no power and you remove hierarchy altogether. It's just different. It's a healthier way.
Yeah. And just to come back to the topic of courage, because I think courage in the context of power, it's also interesting. And what I'm thinking of, that if the more formal power you have, the less courage you need.
The more formal power you have, the less courage you need. Possibly, yes. I think about it. So if I can define how I think about courage, and we'll come back to power, because power is in my definition of courage. And you can, the standard definition of courage is doing something hard and maybe even doing something right in the face of your fears. And building on that, my definition of courage is, I think about it as an equation. It's a bit of an unusual equation. It's power, coming back to your point, power plus purpose divided by dragons. And I'll break that down, if I may. Power, in my understanding of power here, is simply capacity to impact your environment. You have an ability to act on your intentions, make your intentions happen. Purpose is making sure that that power is wedded to a worthy cause. That's there's a moral dimension to courage as well. And then the denominator dragon is a stand-in for all the stuff that gets in the way. So it's your fear, and it's your anxiety, and it's your ego, and whatever else, your insecurities, whatever else makes it harder for you to do the thing that you're trying to do. And so in a workshop where maybe we talk about courage, strategically, what I'm trying to do is give people the knowledge and the tools to increase the numerator and decrease the denominator. But power is an essential component of it, because it's an ability to do something. It's not a nefarious force of some kind. And I don't mean it as formal authority, but I just mean capacity and ability.
Beautiful. And then basically, if you have lots of fear, lots of anxiety, you need even more power in order to have the courage.
Yes. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
exactly correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did you come up with this equation?
I don't know. I just did. Probably in the shower.
Mm.
I have a little notebook in the shower and that I constantly use. I love coming up with ideas both in on the toilet and in the shower. So my favorite places to come up with ideas. Yeah, and maybe I was watching like Game of Thrones. Like I like dragons and I should say when I'm talking about dragons here, I'm talking about dragons as conceived of like in the medieval West, like Game of Thrones or House of Dragon, and in Western mythology. I don't mean dragons as conceived of in China or in Japan in the East, which is a really like a noble symbol and
Power.
sense of vitality of life. It's a very, very positive symbol, very, very different understanding of that symbol. And I became really aware of that because my wife is from China. And when I shared with her my equation, she's like, why does dragon mean this? And so I was like, oh, yeah, there's definitely a bias here that I need to be aware of and articulate when I talk about my definition of courage.
And yeah, and might totally turn it around. And maybe courage is also different in cultural contexts.
Yes.
Whether it's something positive or negative. I remember that a client of mine actually, he looked at me at some point and said, Miriam, don't forget that courage is born out of fear.
Yeah, courage is born out of fear. I think one of the biggest misconceptions around courage is that it's fearlessness.
Mm.
The other day, somebody on my team wrote to me and described me in jest, like as a fearless leader. And I think in jest, I don't know, I took it in jest. And I was like, but thinking about that, it's like, that's not a very courageous leader. And so, yeah, you need, courage is not like, it's not the absence of fear. Mm-hmm. It's often just the recognition that there's some things more important than your own fear. Like that's what that is. And as a teacher, I think you need to have a lot of courage, and that's something that's more important than fear. Is coming back full circle to what we mentioned earlier, but linking outwards, like your action, to something beyond yourself. Like that's the secret to courage.
Beautiful. And yes, the fearless leader almost sounds overconfident. So yeah. A fearless leader, if you don't have fear, then you might take risks that are not worth it, or that would endanger the purpose, the bigger cause.
Yeah.
And thinking of your definition of courage, then, and what you said about psychological safety, then almost means that a courageous leader is taking in all that fear and overcoming it on behalf of the group. So there's one who needs to be courageous in order to create the psychological safety for the others, so that they don't have to be courageous.
So yes, sort of. I partly agree with that. I think that no matter how good and how skillful you are in creating a climate of psychological safety, you'll still need courage. The people, the participants will still need courage. The people on your team will still need courage, even if they know that you are not going to judge them harshly and that they're going to be accepted for what it is that they have to say. There's some conversations that no matter level of psychological safety, that people are still going to feel some anxiety around.
So whenever it becomes vulnerable and personal, you mean?
Yeah.
Admitting
mistakes.
Thank you. Yes.
Admitting mistakes, sharing an idea that's a little bit different, giving somebody I care about tough feedback. I know that you're not going to judge me and you're not going to disrespect me and you're not going to fire me, but it's still hard for me to do so, and hard for a number of reasons. Some of them could just be my personal history, my biography, like whatever it is. There'll still be a need for courage. It just won't be the same level of need as an environment where psychological safety is wanting.
Yeah. So how do is it the same? Do we need the same tools to create an environment for people to be courageous as an environment to feel psychologically safe?
I think it's slightly different. As I think you can split track it here, like in two different tracks. Is one is like, what skills do I need as a leader to create an environment where people are willing to take those interpersonal risks?
Mm-hmm.
And there I can think about, like, how do I communicate the message of why that's important? I can think about listening and questioning skills. I can think about what is my philosophy around failure, and how do I articulate that to my team. I can think about how I elicit feedback, how I share my own developmental areas. Like, all of those things are really, really important for creating that environment, that culture, and constantly like checking in and testing for that. Very, very important. Assessing it. There's another skill set though for having the courage to do some of this stuff, which is the inter and intrapersonal skills that people need to develop regardless of the environment.
So this is then where trust comes in?
Trust, I think, comes in more on as a function of both, maybe. But here I'm thinking about, how do I regulate my own emotions in order to be courageous? So those intrapersonal skills. Thinking
Okay.
about, how do I communicate my message effectively? How do I do so reducing in a way that reduces defensiveness and increases receptiveness on the part of my partner? Those are different focus area, different levels of skills to develop.
Good one. Thank you. What is your number one facilitation challenge?
My number one facilitation challenge currently, I think to not to get in my own way, I would say. And what I mean by that is, somebody maybe does something in a session that catches my attention in a negative way, and then I'll kind of split and I'll still do my job, but in my head I'm beginning to like evaluate what I did, or maybe evaluate what they're doing, and I'm multitasking like when it's happening, and I can't but imagine that decreases the quality of the facilitation, and I'm just not as present in the moment. And so getting out of my own way, I think here, and that's our dragon, if you will, that I need to constantly slay.
Yeah, and it relates to what you said previously, this inward focus.
That's right.
Then suddenly, instead of the outward focus to be there for the group.
Yeah. How about yourself?
I think, yeah, being triggered is one. And even maybe before the workshop is to get the purpose right. Because what I realize most of the times is, even the briefing is as good as they want, and I speak with all the participants, and then someone decides, okay, this is the workshop going to be about, and then you arrive, and where in fact there's something clearly more important that needs to be addressed first. Or the lack of, and that maybe goes hand in hand, is the rushing into things, not acknowledging that before we can speak content, we need to create connection and relations. So in order to have creative new ideas, or in order to challenge each other, for which we need to be courageous, we first need to create the space where we trust each other and where we feel psychological safety.
Yeah, that's another really interesting one, and I think sometimes that space, it's like bi-directional, right? So you're doing something to create it, and as you're doing it, like the trust follows. Like, sometimes we need trust in order to do it, and sometimes we need to do it and trust is just follow. I think often we assume like we need to have first trust and then everything else, and then we can be vulnerable, for example, but sometimes it's the other way around.
Chicken and egg.
Yeah, and that's kind of an interesting challenge as a facilitator. Sure.
How do you create that?
that being what?
The atmosphere where either trust can be created or psychological safety can be created to kick it off.
I do a few things. One is I think about, before going in, I think about my audience. So I get in kind of the right mindset. I actually have a little chair here, you see, and for those who are just listening, it's a tiny little chair that I put next to my computer. If I'm doing a virtual session, I'll take with me if it's an in-person session, and it's there to remind me of my audience and remind me of what it's like to be them going into that particular session, and I may have some information about them that I got from a sponsor, and that might be useful, it might be not, I don't know, but it puts me in the right mindset. So that's like the first thing that I do, and it might be even just like a couple of minutes before the session, but that's kind of my switch. And then it's a matter of like making those early connections with people, and it could be just asking a particular question, from if it's a one-on-one at first, or some people are coming in, and it could be using some humor in the element. It may be showing some vulnerability on my end. Like there are many different ways that I think probably unconsciously like create connections with people, and then through the content itself, I think that people are able to sniff out like both quality and the authenticity of the content and the speaker very, very quickly. What the research shows us is that one of the first things that people assess right away is when they see you, and especially when you begin the workshop, is your level of warmth, like how friendly you are towards them, and your level of competence. Like, do you know what you're talking about? Can you deliver on your intentions? And we need to do both of those to, I think, engender trust. So it might be in my bio, in the way I talk about myself, demonstrating some competence. It might be in the way I articulate my messages. And then the warmth is these moments of connection. It's the use of humor. It's the type of questions that you ask. It's the way in which you respond to your audiences and what they say and what they don't say. All of that goes. It's the nonverbals. Even virtually, like, am I making eye contact with you right now? Am I looking at the camera? Am I opening up my own body language here? Or am I closing up? Am I opening this medial line between my belly button and my collarbone, even when you cannot see it, fully? It's a gesturing. It's moving in a little bit closer when somebody is speaking. It's those little things, these kind of micro behaviors that verbally and non-verbally that go a long way in establishing whether this person is trustworthy on the level of warmth and the level of competence.
And thank you for guiding us through a few pointers on how to read body language, even through the screen, right?
And through the screen, yeah.
Because there is something, I guess, as you said, just leaning in and being closer to the camera, literally revealing more about ourselves, being more seen. Right. Opening up, maybe also even showing our hands in the camera. I think it does something to our brains that suddenly we feel, okay, don't have a gun, I'm safe. Exactly.
Yeah. And even like the camera angle, like, are you looking down at somebody? Are you looking up? Are you looking straight ahead? I think these little things matter subconsciously or are impactful subconsciously.
Yes. And I would like to come back to the warmth. I totally get that. And I wonder, because you mentioned beforehand the negotiation. And that, are you still training negotiation skills, or is this from your academic career?
Both. And I actually just revamped our Next Arrow's negotiation workshop, courageous negotiation workshop, and I'm really, 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 really excited in sharing it with people. So I love teaching negotiation.
And I wonder, good, to what extent warmth in negotiation can actually be counterproductive or even used in a more manipulative way.
In a more manipulative way?
Yeah, because if you're negotiating, you can collect some points through charisma, through warmth, and shifting the attention away from the arguments, maybe.
Right. I think in most negotiation scenarios, they're technically like a mixed mode of conflict, where you have incentives to compete and incentive to collaborate with the other person. If there is a shadow, like there's a long shadow of the future, if there's a relationship involved, the warmth factor is very, very important, because people are constantly assessing, can I trust this person? And can I collaborate with them? Will they act on their intentions? Will they, do I want to meet with them again? And that's where the warmth factor, are they a friend or are they a foe? Do they have also my interests in mind? Not just their own. Obviously, they have their own concern for themselves, but they also have concern for me and my own interests and my own needs. That's where the warmth factor, I think, is so important. Can it be used in a manipulative way? Of course. Of course. And people, and you can think about the caricature of the kind of the slimy sales person, like a car sales person. And it's probably a bad rap to like cars sales reps. But like, yeah, people are saying, oh, they will find all kinds of ways to create common identity with you and to compliment you and to just have you like them. And people do that. And of course, people misuse that as a tactic of influence. But you will probably figure out very quickly whether that person is authentic or not.
Yeah, good point. And as you were speaking, I was just thinking that actually, especially in negotiation, the warmth factor is so important, because our brain cannot function and listen to any content if we don't trust each other. And it's through the warmth that we build the first connection. We can relax our animal instincts and then really focus on the other person.
Yeah. And that's why, for example, small talk is, and it has a bad rap and it's a horrible term for it, like small talk, but it's a bonding ritual, right? It's a relationship audition. That's what small talk is. And it makes a difference. Like, we have research and negotiation that even if you engage in like a 5-minute conversation that's solely dedicated to making some kind of connection with the other person, you are significantly more likely to reach a deal with them in comparison to a control group that, time is money, just get straight to business. So it is vital from a human perspective to make those connections, especially where there's vulnerability involved, and often in negotiation there is.
Which then basically links back to facilitation, because in a facilitated conversation, we always start with a sort of check-in, which is a warm-up, which is maybe the equivalent of small talk.
Yeah. What's your, when you think about the word small talk, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
A waste of time and energy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think like a lot of people think about it, but maybe if you reframe it as like a bonding ritual,
yes,
or a relationship audition, there's maybe a different orientation towards it.
And I think then it, again, to link back to what we discussed earlier in the conversation, it links back to the question we are asking. Yeah. So the bonding ritual at the beginning, the check-in, doesn't need to be small talk. It can also be deep talk, without going too deep. But for instance, in Germany, I think most of Europe, one of the small talk topics would be the weather, or would be the public transportation or the traffic situation to drive somewhere.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make any sense, or it doesn't have any purpose instead of maybe finding commonalities and warming up the vocal cords.
But the commonalities, I wouldn't underestimate the commonalities.
Yeah.
And so we both have this experience of the weather. And so I'm trying to communicate to you that we have something in common, like common grounds, like right away, when we do something like that. I agree with you that it's probably not, it wouldn't be my go-to, but even there you can tweak it. So for example, do you remember my first question to you ever?
Mm-hmm.
Do you?
Ever?
Yeah.
This was the exploration call. No, I don't remember that.
I asked you, instead of asking you, how's your day? Which is kind of this perfunctory thing that we do for small talk. I ask you, what's been the highlight of your day?
Yes.
And you were taken aback by that. You paused, you had to think about it. And then you shared with me some personal information, and it went way beyond like, how's your day going, which isn't really an authentic question, right? So it's making that small tweak. It's like, where are you dialing in from? Somebody comes into your workshop, where are you dialing in from? What's your favorite place? What's your favorite thing about Portland?
Yeah.
Right? And it's asking that follow-up questions, is getting a little bit more specific. It's giving people a question that they would like to answer. And so even there, you can make it work, I think.
Wonderful example. And it almost sounds like asking for the weather is as fake as the used car dealer trying to make connections, because it's so easy that it almost sounds desperate.
Yeah.
Whereas there are other easy questions that, as you said, that can make the connection. And actually, no, it's the follow-up question that really makes the connection. So the first question might actually be just a warm-up.
Yeah, yeah. You see a picture of somebody's family, you ask him about a picture of somebody's family, and then you follow up, which is your favorite kid?
Yeah.
Humor. You see, humor is the other aspect to make a connection. But it's a win.
And then the call might be very short.
Yeah.
Good one. Talking about short calls, what makes a workshop fail?
Ooh, that's such an interesting question. If you could read the book, if you could watch the course online, then and gotten the same amount of usefulness, then the workshop failed.
Which is again kind of a waste of time.
It might not even be necessarily a waste of time. You're absolutely right in the sense that if people felt like this was not a good use of my time, that's a huge failure. It could still feel like it was a good use of their time, but they could have gotten it somewhere else, doing something else. And as a facilitator, there's such a rich opportunity when we do a training, because you have so much wisdom, so much knowledge, so much lived experience in that room. And if you don't create, coming back to power with, if you don't create something interesting and novel and challenging together, then you miss that opportunity. And you can't do that with a book alone, and you can't do that if you just watch passively some LinkedIn learning course or something similar, which have value, but it's a different value than a live workshop, be it virtual or in person.
Absolutely. Thank you. +1, +100. And it's almost showing disrespect for the participants, for those who are in the room, if they don't get the chance to speak and contribute.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, because if we're already sharing time and attention with each other, let's share everyone's experience and knowledge for the benefit of all.
Plus 1,000 back. And I think the word that really stands out when you're speaking to me is the word disrespect. And again, thinking about the origin of words, as I mentioned to you in the beginning, like I love studying the origins of word. The Latin origin of the word respect is respectus, which means to see someone again. So spect is in spectacles, to see is again. And so you're not actually seeing your audience, you're not seeing them if that's what you're doing in a classroom setting. And that's why it's a disrespect, because I'm not seeing you.
Thank you. I will think more about that. The origins of the word respect and disrespect. I haven't thought of that. Thanks. And I would be curious, as a professor, highly educated, you read you taught negotiation in classroom at a university. And there you were teaching, I guess. Maybe you used some facilitation skills. And now you're training adults in negotiation skills.
Yeah.
How do you do that? How do you shift gears to keep this open mind? One, also from the ego perspective, to keep an open mind. Okay, we're here to co-create. Yes, I might be the most knowledgeable person in the room about negotiation, and still be open that, okay, there's so much wisdom in the crowd that we want to harvest as well. And how do you also give them the space to contribute and not to sit down and think, well, the professor is here, who am I to contribute anything?
Yeah, it used to be more of a divide for me. I've kind of fused it together because I really think that the approach that we develop in the skills and the tools in the facilitation world is necessary in the classroom as well. There's a difference, and there's a difference in the power structure, and there's a difference in the amount of time that you meet and in doing homework and how involved the students are and all of that. But right at the outset, I tell them, like, this is going to be a failure if you're not going to be involved. If this is not bi-directional, it's one directional, then we're not going to succeed. Like, we're doing this together. You have knowledge, you have wisdom, you have perspectives that I care about. I have biases that I want, that we're going to explore as well as you do, and we have that conversation. And I think that's one way to approach that challenge.
So to speak out the invitation.
Yeah. And then act on those intentions, like follow it up. It's one thing to say it.
Yeah, exactly.
Do the opposite. But throughout the semester, people are going to, and especially those initial conditions, there's a lot of research on complex systems, and then it's a field called dynamical systems theory, which show us that those systems are very, very sensitive to initial conditions. How you start something goes a long way in determining its trajectory. And classroom setting and a workshop setting is a complex social system. And so it's very sensitive to beginnings. And you have the beginning, obviously, of the semester, the beginning of the workshop, the beginning of the class. But what you say and what you do in the beginning will influence everything else. And to be consistent, of course, is crucial. The other thing that is, I think, important with using that model of the workshop or the classroom as a complex system is that these systems are not linear. And what I mean by that, there isn't always proportionality between cause and effect. And so the learning is not always going to be obvious. And as a teacher and as a facilitator, you need to be aware of that. And that's why judging the success of a workshop isn't always as easy as giving like a feedback score of how useful this was, or how engaging this was, or how knowledgeable the facilitator was.
Because the penny might drop only months later.
Exactly.
And yeah, I totally see that the way we start goes a long way, and we can make or break it within the first minutes.
Yeah.
I just posted something because for the first time in a long time, I stepped into a virtual workshop and I was welcomed by silence. Well, there was a little bit of music, but otherwise it was just silent. And I felt so awkward. And I'm good with silence. I love to play with silence if it's intentional. And I felt so awkward that I immediately opened some tabs and tried to distract myself because I didn't know where to put myself. Then the workshop was amazing.
Yeah.
And still it induced something into the system that could have been avoided.
Yeah. I think that it probably also depends on like the cultural norms of that community. Like there are communities that begin in silence as a norm. And so it could have been deliberate. right? And then for us coming in, when we have kind of different norms, like that creates the dissonance that could have been your experience, or it could be something completely different, right? But it's interesting that it turned out to be an amazing workshop.
Yeah.
I think that's also telling. As a facilitator, sometimes like a version of that is you ask a question and you get crickets, you get silence, and like, what do you do with that? And oftentimes I think there's a lot of pressure that we feel to fill up that silence with noise. But if you wait, something emerges. It's just a matter of having the patience there. I often like would actually mention what I just mentioned right now, crack a joke. And I talk about how in grad school, when you first do your dissertation, they put you out there in the classroom and there's that silence and you really don't know what to do with it. And you feel so awkward and it feels like forever, even though it was like 2 seconds, it feels forever. But then you learn to zip it and see what emerges. And often something emerges. And I say that, and then I stop. And in my head, I'll count to like 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds. And like clockwork, somebody will summon the courage to speak, and then they'll say something.
Yes. Yes. And I think it also has to do with trust and respect towards a group.
Yeah.
So if I give them time to think about it, I show that I really care, that I'm curious and interested in what they have to say, as opposed to I ask a question, nobody answers, I give myself an answer. So I'm actually not really interested. And I honor that it might be challenging as a question, so I give them some time. And yeah, trusting that something will come up. And the funny thing is, it always does.
Always does.
And sometimes you have to count longer than 10. And eventually someone will break the silence.
Have you ever done that, Miriam? Have you ever been like counting longer than 10?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That feels like an eternity. I salute you.
It does. And it is uncomfortable. And the group somehow appreciates it. Yeah. And then it depends on the audience. So if it's so I work a lot with facilitators, and then it's a fantastic topic to just address how to use silence and what silence means and the different sounds of silence. Because sometimes people just digest content and need time, and then there's this reflective silence. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes you have the awkward silence where everyone is like, okay, so what are you doing? This is really awkward. And nobody dares to speak. And then you have the curious silence, or just the disengaged silence. Yeah. Nobody cares. You also have a silence. And this is sometimes the loudest.
On that note, I think that we have to be careful around the disengaged silence to not misinterpret what we see. I've learned this the hard way, and I've had workshops where I'm looking at the audience and I'm like, in that internal voice, I'm like, they hate this. This is a waste of their time, because I'm looking at these faces and they look very disengaged to me. And then I'm looking at the feedback scores afterward, both quantitative and qualitative, and they loved the session. It was very engaging and very useful, and they write all this great stuff. And I'm like, how is there such a disconnect between what I see and what they're writing? And it's anonymous feedback. They have no incentives to be nice to me or to the other facilitators. And I learned to I learned to quiet that voice when I see those faces. And maybe they're disengaged, maybe they're not. But I recognize that sometimes it's just people's thinking faces.
The resting bitch face.
Maybe that, but a thinking face isn't always like like scratching your chin or whatever it is. Like sometimes it's just somebody giving you that blank look, and that's them processing information. And we should read I think two too much into it. So and that's still sometimes a challenge. As you mentioned, like, what are some challenges? Sometimes I'll see that and I'll forget that. And it reminds me, there's a line from the Greek, from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, not the Greek, but the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. I don't remember if it was Greek or Roman, but he said that oftentimes it's not things that disturb us, it's our interpretation of things. He didn't say actually oftentimes. He said always. It's not things that disturb us, it's our interpretation of that reality. And as a facilitator, like, that is something that often happens. You think it's something objective that's disturbing you. It's really your interpretation of what it is that you're seeing, including that face, including that silence, whatever it may be. And you just got to turn that off and just be present.
Yeah. And then our judgment of ourselves that gets in the way, and then suddenly makes it about us instead of the group.
That's right. That's right.
I once spoke with the facilitator, and I loved what she said about when participants have their cameras off, that she used to take it personally, or they have the cameras off because they are doing something else, they're distracted. And then she realized that she can just reframe it, that, oh, it might be so early in someone's time zone that, and being in the workshop and in the session was so important that they didn't have time to make their hair. So they are here anyway. And it's more important than the camera. Or they don't want to be distracted and they're visually sensitive. So they turn the camera off. And I like that, to find ways to just reframe it if we cannot turn the voice off.
Right. So you reframe it, reinterpret the story you're telling yourself. Yeah. That from an emotion regulation perspective is also, I think, a very important thing to do. So I love that. Because
our reaction to the facts, our reaction to our interpretation of the so-called obvious facts will then also impact the group, because you will hear it in someone's voice whether they feel annoyed or judgmental.
It'll impact your body, your physiology, your emotions, and it'll therefore impact the group for sure.
Yeah. And then the courageous thing to do would then to just voice it.
If it benefits the group, yes. Right. So I agree. If it benefits the group for voicing it, I've been in session where the facilitator is too into, like, I'm going to be vulnerable, and they're constantly being vulnerable, and it's really about themselves. It's not in service of the group. And so they're voicing it too much because they're trying to get rid of their own anxiety in this way. And you can say, well, that's in the service of the group, but it doesn't come across that way. But there are other times where voicing it, I think, is in fact in service of the group, of assessing what's happening here, like right now, and changing the dynamics.
Interesting. Yes. Thank you for the distinction. And I think what you said is it in service of the group? So to understand the group and thereby maybe adjusting the process, as opposed to calming my own anxiety by speaking it out.
Yeah.
It's a nuance.
Nuance. Yeah.
How do you know? So what's the right level of authenticity?
Yeah. Are you asking as an
audience, vulnerability,
as an audience member, or like, how do I know if somebody is just vomiting their vulnerability all over us, or as a trainer, as a facilitator?
Both.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think as the audience member, you'll pick it up where you're just like, oh, not again. Like, you have not again. Can you please, like, get on with it? Like, if you're annoyed by all this vulnerability, I think that might be a sign. For yourself, like, how do you know whether it's in service of the group or not? I'm not sure. I think that you might benefit from asking yourself that question, like, okay, I'm about to do this. How does this serve what I'm trying to do, or what we're trying to create here? And if you can come up with a good answer to that, that is authentic, you're not lying to yourself, then, and it has to be quick, right? Because it's happening live, then that's helpful. It might be like you have a reminder, like an if-then rule, that you ask yourself that question before, or maybe during the break, or whatever it is, before you ask the question, or before, I'm sorry, you share your vulnerability, and that will allow you to assess whether you should or whether you shouldn't. Just asking that question might be useful, but I don't have a good answer to that question. I don't know like how exactly like you discern, and I do agree that it's a fine line. I would say default into asking yourself at least that question.
I agree. And I think if you sense that you have the urge to share that because you feel uncomfortable, and not because you feel uncomfortable about your emotions instead of uncomfortable about the process.
Right. Yeah, that's a nice distinction. And then, of course, let the data speak as well. Look at what people say. Get the feedback. Don't be afraid to get that feedback. Get the feedback, and then look if there's a gap between what you thought and what you got. And if that's the case, then it may cause you to question, like pressing on the brake in the middle of a session, saying, "We need to do a 180 right now. We need to assess like what's happening right now. This quiet in the room, like what's that about?" Or I understand that you don't want to be here right now. Like whatever it is that someone might say at that moment. And if I'm doing that quite often, then maybe there's a problem in my own perception. And if there's a gap between what I think and what I get, then I probably shouldn't do it as often as I think I should.
Yeah, and I like the provocation in that.
Yeah.
Giving them the chance to say, no, we don't want to be here, or the silence is awkward or disengaged. Yeah.
Miriam, were we recording when you told me the story about you splitting the room up?
I don't think so.
Do you mind sharing that with the audience, because it's such a powerful example of doing this well?
Yeah. Before we recorded, I shared the story and of me teaching coming in for a training, and I heard on the corridor while going to the room that those who were attending the training were basically forced to do that. So before we started anything, I just shared that, and I said, well, I heard that some of you don't want to be, sorry, I cannot tell you the same story again. Gordon, can you please cut that out? Thank you. I cannot share the same story with you that
Cannot. Okay.
I'm too self-aware then.
Too self-aware.
You can share the story.
Okay. So you shared. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. And now, so cut all that out, Gordon. And now I ask you, why don't you share the story?
Yeah. So before we start recording, you shared with me an example, I think, of you doing this well, and of doing something unusual, of doing something surprising, of breaking a pattern. You had a training. Somebody told you right before the training, nobody wants to be in this training. They're forced to be in this training. And you began by acknowledging that, but you didn't just say it out loud. And you didn't say, okay, here's the door. If you don't want to be here, I'm not going to keep you prisoner. Like, that's not how I do things, which would have been a way of handling it. You ask people to stand up, which is something unusual. And you divided the room and say, I want everybody who wants to be here to be on one side of the room. I want everybody who doesn't want to be here to be on the other side of the room. And so you had this kind of unusual thing. And I'm sure there were some giggles along the way, because you have now a visual representation. You got people to get up, to move their bodies, which is great. And then you, if I recall correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, you said those of you who don't want to be here, you brought them to the front. Is that what you did?
No, I actually stood in the corner where I said, those who don't want to be here, come here and stand with me, to basically make it easier for them.
Wait, does that mean that you were on the side that didn't want to be there?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to be in this workshop either, if you don't want to be here. Fantastic. And then, if I recall correctly, you said, let's just try this out. Let's use this as an experiment. And if after half an hour, or whatever, at break, I don't remember exactly what you said, you don't want to be here, feel free to leave.
Feel free to leave. Yeah. And they all came back even on time. Thank you for sharing the story on my behalf.
You won them over. This is it. I love this story so much. This is and it takes courage to do what you did. It's spontaneous, it's creative, it's wise, it's example of how we should be doing stuff like that. So yeah,
thank you. And just
inspiring.
Thank you for appreciating. Try it out, and then it's your story.
Yes. Yeah, well, sometimes we do get this, right? We get, one of my least favorite things to hear from a sponsor is, oh, you should know that so and so is in the room and he really or she really does not want to be here, and they're going to let you know it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I don't need to hear that. I don't need to hear that at all, because, and the reason is not because I get nervous, it's because now there'll be a bias towards that particular person.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm going to pay attention more to that person, and at the expense of other people in the group potentially. And it may impact how I treat them, at the very least, subconsciously, if not consciously.
Yeah.
And I don't want to hear any information about the individuals there, even though I see where that's limited. Because in your example, if you did not hear that information, you wouldn't have begun that way.
Yes. So I think it's, it was general information. It wasn't about the individuals. The same client, they wanted initially, or they even sent me the CVs of all the participants. And then when I arrived, asked me whether I read them. I'm like, no, I don't want to know. And I don't want to know what person is associated with what kind of rank in the hierarchy, because precisely for what you just explained, I don't want to be biased in the way I interact with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't tell me who the CEO is.
Yes. I mean, usually you find out very quickly.
Very quickly.
And the way how you find out will tell you so much about the group and how they relate to each other and what kind of leadership model they're referring to, that there's a lot of information you can gain from that. So I think there's even value in not knowing and trying to guess in the first kind of moments of interaction, and then pointing it out. If you have a leadership or a team building workshop and referring to that, okay, I noticed that nobody's speaking except the CEO, or CEO always starts speaking and then everyone agrees.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. We started with courage, talked about questions. And dragons.
Here's my dragon.
Yes. And I remember from last time you mentioned dragons and zombies. And before closing, I do want to ask the question, what do zombies have to do with the dragons?
So zombies, that comes from a workshop that we give, an XR called Courageous Presentations. And it's really looking at some of like the deep-seated fears that a lot of us have in both designing and delivering presentations. And so the dragons or zombies are symbolic. And specifically the zombie, it comes from a thought experiment that I came up with in the shower. And it's called it's like the zombie sentence. And the basic, it's coming up with a zombie sentence. And what that means is I'm thinking for a moment that if I gave it a different name than the zombie sentence, but anyway, we can edit that. The zombie thought experiment is the following. Before you give a presentation, I want you to imagine that a group of zombies attacked your audience. And they went for their brains, because that's what zombies like to do. That's what they like to eat. But they're generous zombies, so they left a little bit of brain in each audience member, and enough brain space to remember one sentence. That's your zombie statement. That's a phrase. It's the zombie statement. And what will that be? What is the essence of what it is that you're trying to communicate to your audience? What is the gist? And if you can articulate that, then you're going to be more ready to deliver that presentation, and you're going to be more kind to your audience if you can deliver your zombie sentence. So, for example, in that workshop, the zombie sentence is, you can't slay your presentation until you slay your dragons. And I like that, because then you have to figure out what your dragons are, and then you have to think strategically about how will you go about in slaying the dragon, or managing your fears, or whatever it is that you want to think about. And in every workshop that I do, I think about, what is my zombie sentence? What is my zombie statement? And how will I communicate that main point to my audience? If they could only remember one thing about what I'm about to say, and oftentimes that's the case, what will that be? And so that's why zombies are with dragons in that particular workshop as a symbol. It's a thought experiment.
I love it. And yeah, the power of storytelling. You could have packaged it differently. You need your audience to remember one sentence, and that's it, because they forget all the rest. And yeah, your audience might forget that. Yeah. But the zombie story, nobody's gonna forget the story of zombies eating your audience's brain.
Right. Yeah. That's it. It's exactly right. You say you need to come up with like a gist statement. Okay, people will remember that, sort of, maybe, probably not. But if it's like, oh, I need, before every presentation, I got to come up with a zombie sentence and a zombie statement, I think that's more memorable.
I love that. Yeah. And since very final question, if I may, since you mentioned this workshop in giving courageous presentations.
Yeah.
According to you, in which role do you need more courage? To be the presenter or to be the facilitator?
I think of the presenter as a facilitator. So I'm not thinking about necessarily presentations where it's one direction, it's unidirectional, and you're standing behind some kind of podium, although that may be the case. In that case, if that's the differentiator, if that's what we're talking about, I'm going to come back to the point that you made, which is, it takes more courage to be that presenter, because you're less likely to communicate those questions. You're more likely to feel the need to give answers and statements to your audience, and that is potentially a little bit scarier. There's more risk involved in there. But I think that a good presenter will also be a facilitator. And in a formal setting, you'll find ways to elicit something out of your audience, and it won't be unidirectional. It won't be one direction.
Do you have a tip for that? Especially since you spoke about the first impression and how to make sure that you start on a high and win the audience for you.
If you're talking about just like straight up like presentations, yeah, I think that there are a few different things that you can do. I mean, one is have somebody else read your bio. Often people will go up there, and then the first thing they'll be like, let me tell you how special I am, because they want to up their power, right?
And the competence next to the warmth.
Next to the warmth, right? Have somebody else do that for you. Because if I'm talking about myself, I may increase my competence but reduce my warmth. And so have somebody else do that for you, I think is one way to do that. I think introducing some right away with finding a way to connect with the audience, some humor, asking questions, even if they're rhetorical questions, getting your audience to move their body even a little bit, like raising their hands in some way, or giving them something to do. Like, those are all ways of generating some, like, increasing levels of engagement and connection with your audience, even in more formal settings. Yeah. But again, I do think that doing this well means that you're going to be at least 20% facilitator, even in those settings.
Yeah.
Plant a question.
I was just thinking of that, and pause after asking the question, even if it's a rhetorical question, to pay respect to your audience and to your question, to give them some time at least to think about it.
Yeah. And when you are engaged like with your audience, it's these little things. You see, like, for example, there was a study that was done by Leanne Renninger, who co-founded Life Labs Learning. And she did a study when she was at the University of Vienna on professors. It was a study with a number of professors on their presentation skills. And she had the participants, she wired up so that if the presenter did something that they liked, they press one button. If they did something that they didn't like, they press another button. If it was confused, there was still another button. And she had like all this data about what people found engaging, what they didn't. And she found some really interesting things. Like, for example, when the professors would ask questions, not rhetorical, but actual questions in the formal presentation, they would take a step back from their audience. Now think about like what that communicates to your audience when you take a step back. And then she asked them later as an intervention to take one step forward when you're asking a question. And she saw like the engagement go up. Like people found, people recognize what was happening there. Because when you're stepping back, you're communicating, I'm afraid of this moment. I'm comfortable. I want to move away from you when you're communicating. When you step forward, you're engaging. Obviously, it's not like an uncomfortable, like somebody like zooming in, but just a slight step forward demonstrates, I'm really interested in what you have to say. It demonstrates competence, confidence, and warmth.
Amazing example. And I just remember that from my days in teaching, when I would ask a question that is really important to me, and where I want the students to engage and reveal something about themselves, I would walk around and stand without the podium or anything between me and the students. So the full exposure. And I think I did this unconsciously.
Yeah.
But now with the facilitator, it just occurred to me now with the facilitator's hat on, that's exactly it. You show vulnerability, physically vulnerability, and invite them into that space, showing that you're interested.
Yeah. I had a more of a formal presentation that I gave a few months ago in Las Vegas. And I was on a stage and there were like, I don't know, 150, 200 people below the stage. And at some point, in maybe 40 minutes into the presentation, I jumped off the stage. Not like in a dramatic way, but I just went off the stage. and I started like moving around the tables. And it changed the whole dynamic of the presentation. Partly because you're injecting surprise and novelty into that moment. People don't expect it. But it changed that hierarchy that we're speaking about earlier, like on high, delivering wisdom to you. Like, no, that's not how I want this moment to go. And then I was able to see people. I was able to make eye contact. I was able to step closer in when I was doing that. And it shifted the whole dynamic. It really did. And so, yeah, as much as we can get rid of that podium, as much as we can get rid of that physical hierarchy that's often created, I think we benefit and our audiences benefit. Yeah.
And also by you walking through the tables, you invite the audience to move their bodies. So not to stare in the same direction, maybe even lift their heads. So they also see each other and maybe engage with each other just from the movement you're inducing.
Exactly.
Thank you.
And I asked them, I said, do you prefer this or do you prefer me up there? They said they said this.
What got you to get off the stage?
I'm not used to the stage, so when I go into an office, it's always like an office space. We're closer together. There isn't. I'm not elevated physically in this way, and it just felt unnatural. It felt comfortable for me to be up there. I saw like what was happening as far as the dynamics, and I wanted to shift it.
Awesome. Also courageous.
Takes a little bit of courage. Yeah. I could have fallen.
Maybe someone would have
Maybe.
held you, catch
Yeah.
you. Then you would be a rock star.
Yeah. 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 I often like to think of myself as a rock star. And you can learn, by the way, maybe we'll end on this. Like from rock stars, you can learn a lot. I'm going to see in a week one of my favorite heavy metal group, and for many decades has been my favorite group, is Iron Maiden.
They
And
still exist.
they still exist. They still sell out arenas and stadiums, and they still create new music as well. But what you can learn from them, I think, as a presenter, is quite a lot. Not just Iron Maiden, but rock concerts. Think about how rock concerts begin. Think about how they go through. Think about how they end. The end of it is never. Let me share with you some new material that I'm working on. Right? It's the encore. It's something people really want. They end on a way that leave people super excited. It's the
They
dessert.
sing together, so they have the connection. Yeah.
Create that, right? And think about it when you facilitate a meeting. Like, how do you want the meeting to end? Do you want to end with just with like, all right, so here are like the next steps, you know, and then it just kind of ends with like just like a thud? Or do you want to end in a way that's more exciting, more engaging, more optimistic, for more inspiring for people together? Same thing with how you structure the beginning of it, the middle of it. There's so much you can learn from what rock bands do in concerts that'll help us become better meeting facilitators and facilitators in general. In the same way of how chefs structure a meal, like the dessert, the main course, the appetizer, the main course, and the dessert. That's how you should structure your presentation as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also to avoid the strong differences. So maybe you get something to clean up the mouth, or to some bread in between, or something to neutralize the taste. That's what I mean, not clean.
Exactly. And it aligns with this, like the research on the primacy and the recency effect as well. So you can make so people are much more likely to remember what you do in the beginning, what you do in the end. So you make multiple beginning, middles, and ends throughout the presentation. I learned that from chefs. I learned that from rock stars, from Iron Maiden.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What a rich conversation.
It's been a pleasure.
What would be the zombie sentence that you want the audience to leave this conversation with? And you can make one up.
Well, I would have to make one up since I've never had this conversation before. Miriam, I'm going to pass that question to you, and then I'll maybe add one, because I'm not avoiding your question. The reason is I've noticed that you are very good at kind of finding, not just summarizing like kind of the main points, but like finding the essence of what somebody says. You do it when you echo and play back what it is you hear your interviewees say to you, and you do it when you summarize things on LinkedIn. Like, I see you constantly doing that, so I think you're probably very good at coming up with zombie sentences. So I'm wondering what comes to your mind, and if you want me to go first, I'll go first, but I would love to hear from you.
After this introduction, and no pressure. I think my zombie sentence would be that it pays off to fight the dragons, to be more courageous, and ask more closed questions. I think these were, I was maybe cheating, because I think these were the big themes or big topics that I'm taking away as nuggets from this conversation.
Yeah. I think you're onto something. For me, I'm thinking about how we talked about courage, and thinking about how you can't achieve excellence as a facilitator without courage, and that would be my dragon statement or sentence for our talk.
Beautiful. I like yours.
I like yours too.
Thank you, Roy. What
Thank
a pleasure.
You. Indeed.
That's the end of the podcast.
That was fun.
Yeah.
I could have gone on for another 2 hours easily.
Yeah.
This was fun.
So many. Yeah, there were a few times. There were maybe 2 or 3 times where like, oh shoot, I forgot to ask this question. Now we are already on the next topic.
Yeah. I felt that. I was like, oh, there's another thought that I want to add to that, just like with the close-ended questions, like thinking about kids, but that's how it works, right? Like it's not gonna always, it's not a prepared thing. It's just going to come as it comes, in that way. Yeah. That was a lot of fun. I don't just give the compliments to make you blush or feel good. Like I do think that you are very good at this. Very good at capturing the essence of what people are saying, very good at asking questions, being curious, being playful when you interview people, helping them feel more at ease. I got more at ease as a conversation developed, and felt it in my answers as well. And I really like what you're doing. Like I'm sure you're a great facilitator from our conversation, but you're also, I think, a really good podcast host. And I can see how Joe Rogan is one of your heroes when it comes to this, and rightly so.
Thank you.
I only got one heart in the recording. I only got one heart. It was like, where's my heart?
I don't use them very often in recordings, actually. So one heart is it's good. And now it's the second one, right? So you got 2 hearts.
I'm just kidding. So what are from what you told me, like the next steps is you all do the editing and all that stuff, like, and so it takes
we do the editing, cut out the blurbs, and then I can, and you're going to be episode 190.
It's a good number,
right? Coming out on November 9th. And a week before, I send you a 1-page summary that you can double check for my English, and whether sometimes if I mess up some information or I get it the wrong way, so you can make any edits you want.
Yeah.
And send me all the links you would like us to put in the show notes. So where the audience can find you, find your courses, all of that. Yeah.
As far as like showing like snippets of it, how does that work? Do you create them? Do we create them? How does it, do you know?
I used to, so we have I have a copywriter, and he listens to the episode and he writes the show notes, and he writes, I think, 3 LinkedIn posts and 3 Instagram posts.
What's the Instagram one?
It's my name, Miriam Hapness.
Oh, I'm gonna send you. What do you call it on Instagram? Then you'll see. Mine is like dedicated to my family, so you'll if you accept the friend request or whatever you call it on Instagram, there you are. Yeah, yours looks like a very professional.
Yeah, it's only podcast, and then my my copywriter at some point, or my social media person, she said, Miriam, you need to show your face. I'm like, who's interested in my face? And like, your followers want to see your face. I'm like, what the fuck? So I started to record the shorts so that people can see my face. And she was so right.
It's the warmth. It's a warmth.
Being approachable, be standing there without the stage. But then I'm like, I'm not the selfie person. I'm like, when I post something, I want to create value, right? So it's competence and warmth. So these 60-second videos are for my way of showing warmth and competence at the same time.
There is like another interesting question, which is like around the gender lens and warmth and competence. So if, for example, in negotiation, in competitive negotiation, like distributive negotiation, when women are more assertive, their competence goes up, they're viewed as more competent, but their likability goes down. And men do not face, they also face that. If I'm being like super assertive, you're not going to like me, but they don't face it to the same degree. And the way out of that in the literature is asking women to explicitly express why they're negotiating, like on behalf of whom. And if they're going to say that I'm negotiating on behalf of my team or a client or family member, then that bias all but disappears. Right? And by the way, it doesn't matter if they're negotiating with another man or another woman, they'll still be judged in the same by the same standards, because when they're being assertive for themselves, they're violating a stereotype.
Yeah.
But when they're being assertive on behalf of others, they're affirming a stereotype, which is like the mama bear.
Yeah. And they,
So that's kind of interesting.
It's very interesting. And it's basically we're unconsciously judging a woman to fall out of the social norms.
Yeah.
And then she's bossy or assertive or whatever, hard.
Yeah.
So what did Hillary Clinton wrong?
Hillary Clinton was,
because she's one of those, right? She's being punished for falling out of the gender stereotypes, for being too harsh.
Yeah, and she was labeled as a nasty woman, right? But that's exactly that. And Hillary Clinton, unfortunately for her, had two things. And one is like, this is like the living with a society that has sexist biases like that would automatically judge, even though people who are very warm naturally, like as less warm when they're being assertive. But Hillary Clinton, unfortunately for her, just didn't come across as warm. Like it just did not happen. She tried, and they told her what to say and what to do, but she just didn't come across, didn't give that presentation of a warm person. Her husband did. Her husband, that's why he was a better communicator than her. They were both amazingly like effective as communicators at getting their point across, and very, very impactful. It's just her husband had a warmth factor that he became his demise too for other reasons, but he had a way of connecting with his audience. And there's a masterclass that both of them have masterclasses now, Hillary and Bill, and they have sections on public speaking, and you'll see the difference there around that. And they're an interesting case study, I think. But this is probably why having somebody read your bio is also helpful. Right, that's like another reason in there. But you see, these are the things we think about after the conversation. In the shower today, I'm going to be like,
if only I've said that.
This is I forgot, like we called it like the zombie statement, and so I called it the zombie sentence. It's my content.
And don't forget that our audience are as much zombies as your audience, so they won't remember, they won't even realize it.
No, it's all good. I really enjoyed it. I hope we can collaborate in the future together in some capacity. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely fun. And the recording will be on YouTube. So and I think that it's also easy to take a snippet out if you want to repurpose it. Otherwise, we'll tag you along, so to speak.
I'm sure that I will do that. Will I be able to see which sections you're selecting for the snippets?
So we stopped doing the sound bites,
Oh, you stopped doing the sound bites.
We stopped doing sound bites as default just because as a yeah, it was just too expensive in the long run in terms of paying someone to do the sound bites. But now with the YouTube, you can just choose them yourself if you.
You can. It's not hard to edit it like that.
I think in the shorts, isn't it that you can from the app on your phone on YouTube, you can basically just cut 60 seconds from any YouTube clip.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah, they make it very easy to repurpose YouTube content to keep people on YouTube.
Yeah,
I guess.
that's very nice. All right, well, I'll be very happy to share and to support and continue share and support. I'm so happy I discovered you and the work that you're doing and to learn from it. So thank you.
Same here, and I really enjoy your LinkedIn content.
Thank you.
Yeah, good thoughts you're sharing. So let's
Appreciate
see
it.
what else will emerge.
I'm sure something will. Take care.
Awesome. Bye.